According to Wikipedia, the word ghost actually comes back to an old Germanic word, an old basically German word, which refers to rage or fury. And this has got some kind of connection to the worship of Odin, that was supposed to be a deity which ruled over hunting and war in one particular interpretation, as well as the ability to ferry the dead to the afterlife. There's also a mention that the belief in ghosts goes back to animism, namely the belief that there's some kind of innate spiritual force or consciousness in things, as well as ancestor worship. In my opinion, the fear aspect associated with ghosts is probably much closer to some of the traditional fears which have been bred into us, into our DNA structure, the genetic heritage of humanity. Just as we have fear of creatures that were within our ancient history, the carriers of disease, or possibly physically dangerous in the fact that they could bite or sting or somehow destroy things which are close to you as a human, such as your food stores. There would have been other fears as well, including the fear of contagion. The very idea of a spirit being essentially the body of a dead person does bring up the fear of contagion in some people, I would imagine. And also it's something which is not in seemingly its right place. Some superstitions, such as not putting a pair of shoes on a table, come from the idea of taking something which is supposed to be in one place, which in this case is on the floor, and placing it somewhere else, like a surface upon which you might work or you might eat, goes against the grain, and therefore a phobia or a fear or a superstition can be built up upon it. That may also be connected to the subject of ghosts as well, if you think about it. Now, the idea of hauntings, I think that's a difficult one, because it has become so heavily enshrined in our mythological culture about ghosts that's what people tend to believe in. They tend to believe that there is a spirit, usually of a dead person, who has suffered from some kind of physical or emotional turmoil, who is somehow bound to or constrained to a certain geographical location. But this is a modern view, not necessarily either an ancient one or one which is based upon facts. Let's say ghosts do exist, therefore what are their properties? We don't actually know these things. And so there's just talk about, a particular spirit appearing on a certain bridge, or a particular spirit always walking along the same path as if it's reenacting a certain horrific sensation. These stories are kind of like blown up by popular fiction, TV shows, movies, and all the rest of that, to the point whereby the idea that a spirit does live in a place is more or less fixed, cast in stone in our consciousness, in our mind's eye, despite the fact that that might not actually be the case. Also, some of the occult writings of the last couple of hundred years have tended to elaborate upon the subject of ghosts, to the point whereby we almost believe, or we do believe, some people believe, that a ghost cannot cross water. I remember one of the writings of Dion Fortune said that she had a very strange feeling come upon her one day, and she went for a walk, which I think was in the park if I remember correctly, and all of a sudden the feeling left her. And then she went back and had a look at the map of that area and learned that there was, where that feeling left her, there was actually a water main going underneath. And so she believed that it was the flow of the water which had actually taken, like, as it were, the negative energy from her aura away from her. This has become more heavily enshrined in ghost lore, and it is therefore believed that ghosts cannot cross water. But again, as far as on the factual side of things is concerned, we don't really know whether the negative energy within the aura of a person, if it exists, has the same features as a conscious existing spirit that can walk around in the outer world, if there are conscious existing spirits happening in the outer world. Okay, well, as far as the different classifications of spirits is concerned, I think you can probably take your pick, because, as I say, cultures tend to grow in their mythologies about what a spirit is or what a spirit can do. There's, within occultism, various different classifications, from elementals and spirits of nature to ghosts, demons, if for those who accept them or believe in them, and of course angelic beings. There's actually like a variety of hierarchy, okay, which Alphonse Louis Constance tended to express in terms of essentially purity. So the most impure or corrupt forms would probably be a demon energy or an elemental energy, and the more pure spirits would be the spirits of a person or the spirits of an angel or archangel, and so on and so forth, up to a certain level of perfection, which would of course be which would be a god character. But again, the beliefs have changed substantially, and we can't really rule out the power even of beautiful but rather trashy supernatural science fiction, such as Ghostbusters from what is now an awful long time ago. There have been, and I've seen this myself on the internet, people who have claimed that they've used a Ouija board to contact a level 5 free floating vaporous apparition and the like. And if you do enough Googling, you'll find people using terminology which has come straight out of fiction to classify something which they don't fully understand. Now, safety when it comes to ghosts is an interesting subject. If you think about it, we as a species haven't really changed biologically all that much since the medieval period. And thanks to the spread of information over the internet, it looks like some medieval values or views seem to be steadily creeping back. And also even the cultural world which I personally inhabit to a certain extent, which is occultism, seems to have adopted some aspects of the magical tradition, shall we say, as part of a methodology to attempt to control spiritual energy. However, some of the things from classical healing techniques weren't necessarily occult in nature, they were more medicinal. For instance, taking a little leather bag, and maybe I've got one lurking around here somewhere, no, not on me, okay, and putting in it maybe a few shavings of a wart and maybe a scroll of paper or parchment with a certain incantation written on it in ink or in blood, placing that into the pouch, and then trying to make sure that your enemy would then get that little pouch so that they would then catch the spiritual negativity, which would then bring about warts on their flesh. That may be the belief. But something like that has been adjusted into a healing technique. There's people who would have, let's say, little leather pouches, and they may put into it stones that they believe have healing properties, and they may carry it on their person. So it's taking medieval ideas and trying to use them to try and bring about a form of spiritual protection, which might or might not necessarily be beneficial. I remember one time when I was actually on a ghost hunt, which was great fun. There was one lady there who was rather afraid of us doing a Ouija board seance. We had a massive round table and, pieces of card with letters written on it, and they were all strewn around the table. Okay, we had a glass overturned in a traditional manner in the middle of the table, and we all put our fingers on it and did the seance. The room was beautifully decked out with as many candles as we could, looked totally gothic horror, and it was the perfect environment to do such a seance, okay? There was just one lady who was afraid, And she said to me, Nick, I just want you to make sure that you've closed the board down afterwards. And so, I did a bit of hocus pocus and that made her happy. Okay. After the seance, we all left the building and I asked her, what did you mean when you said close the board down? And she said, I don't know. So she was making a claim out of fear, and she didn't really know what the meanings of the words were, nor indeed how that was actually applicable to the seance itself. This is due to the fact that, the ability to be afraid is like quite hardwired into us. And sometimes you can get an irrational fear, sometimes you can get a seemingly rational fear, and sometimes you can get a rational fear. And I'll have to leave it up to you to decide which one of those three she had. Oh, and I'll just very quickly add before I turn the camera off and go to the next segment, that apparently the tradition of closing down the Ouija board properly is to move the planchette or indicator, whichever one you've got, onto the goodbye position, and that is apparently the technique which is in our modern tradition of how to close down your Ouija board seance properly. However, of course, I'll quickly point out that that is a belief rather than necessarily a scientific fact. Okay, is dealing with spirits in any way at all, or attempting to deal with spirits, or believing in spirits in any way whatsoever, somehow evil? Well, there is a part of the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament which says that it's not, it's sinful, it's negative, it's not good. This is the 18th chapter of Deuteronomy, verse 9 to 12, apparently. The book of Deuteronomy was added to the Old Testament during a time when there was a need to regulate society, so I understand. And it was suddenly, in inverted commas, discovered by the people in that area, so that society could then be controlled. The way I see it is it's just a form of popular regulation of society during a time of turmoil. It's not necessarily anything, okay? It's almost like there's a superstitious belief in trying to make the Bible itself the ultimate authority for everything, the ultimate literal authority. But that is in its own right pure superstition, because there's no way that you can prove that the book was actually written by God, and in fact it's written on paper or parchment or vellum or papyrus, shows that it's not actually written by God, it's written by people who've got pens and quills and that sort of thing. So it's more like the views of people who feel that they're doing what's right for society through trying to perpetuate certain forms of values, rather than necessarily any real hard and fast fact. Okay? From a more rational point of view, if God created the universe, then God created nature. Anything that happens in the natural world, or anything that happens in the world, has to, of course, by its very nature, be natural, and therefore it's important to try and find these things out. That would be an important point of view to take. However, not everybody shares those views, which I think is really rather sad. The religious interpretation of ghosts is very variable. There's people within the Judeo-Christian traditions may be afraid because they may assume that ghosts are, or possibly could be, demons in disguise, which again goes back to another biblical passage, which I think is New Testament. I couldn't really tell you off the top of my head. The Islamic people believe that they might be jinn, and that is a different classification of spirits as understood by the Islamic people. Islamic people do believe in psychics, but they believe that it is in fact the jinn that has the power of prophecy and speaking to other spirits and so on and so forth, not the clairvoyant or psychic themselves. So that's quite interesting. Whereas the Buddhists, on the other hand, just believe in different levels of reality. And I think it's the Buddhist interpretation which has got more heavily ingrained in the New Age culture. because the belief in different planes of reality or levels of reality has become expanded upon. I even used to know someone who believed that there was a plane somewhere in the universe where Star Trek was a literal reality and any book, any work of fiction was in fact literally true, which I think is even more far-fetched than believing in an afterlife, in my humble opinion. Okay, does an exorcism work? This is quite an interesting one because, again, it's down to belief. And it depends upon the type of exorcism. I remember watching one episode of Paranormal State in which you got like the main guy from the TV show who's threatening a spirit through saying, "What if I was to get a Roman Catholic priest here? Ha! That would show you." Which I think is hilarious. There are different types of exorcism as well. The Jewish method, which is quite interesting, actually requires 10 people, one of whom represents each of the spheres on the tree of life, and they all do different roles to try and heal the spirit which is possessing somebody. So it's an attempt to be rather humane, not only to the person who is suffering from demonic possession, but also to the demonic spirits or ghosts that may be possessing the person in question. Whether these things work or not, I mean, who the hell knows? We've got there hasn't been sufficient testing done. However, on some in-depth psychological level, these things could have an impact upon some people, taking into account their own psychology. I'm of the opinion that humans are still quite primitive creatures. We may have like Windows 7 technology, we may have like an electricity grid, but as far as have we actually evolved all that far in the past couple of hundred years, I think the short answer would have to be no. Our culture has changed, but that's an artificial thing. It's not a biological thing. And so, yeah, there's ways in which we can use superstition positively to try and adjust or improve our lives. So a form of study, whether it's formal or informal, could actually be useful if you're to learn how to incorporate some positive aspects of superstition into your life, taking into account your own self-knowledge and what you think could help. I still think the word "it works" or "it doesn't work" is actually rather inappropriate. There's just various different types of strange phenomena which occur, and it's just fun to explore and experiment. Okay, I just want to elaborate on one more point before I move on. I do think that there is something of the pre-enlightenments and the pagan inside everybody. I don't think this is something we can fight. It's just as instinctive as phobia or fears of snakes or fear of the dark. It's the way that we're created. Okay. I remember a time many years ago, so I was brought up by a very hard atheist, namely my mother. And she says, well, we got this Bible just taking up space on the shelves. And I turns around to her and says, well, why don't you throw it away then? And then she sort of went pale and says, no, I don't want to. Suppose something happens. And I thought, what's wrong with you? It's a book. You can throw it away, you can burn it, it doesn't matter. But no, she was pretty fearful. This hard atheist who, loved Dawkins and respected science and all the rest of that. And she was terrified about throwing a Bible away, which I thought was rather curious. Okay, well, so what about this one particular season that we're in at the moment? Namely, this is the month of October, we're on the run-up to Halloween. What about this season? Okay, well, for us, in our nice, comfortable buildings, whether you're in a rented room or whether you're, living inside a house which you own, or you're paying off the mortgage, or you're staying in a hotel room, or whatever, we don't feel the seasons as badly as people did 100 years ago. And I think you could probably safely say that the mentality of the people then was that it's going to get a lot colder. Okay, you don't know whether you stored up enough food, and things could get a bit difficult. The old people, if they get cold, they could die. And so it was basically a time of anxiety and fear and death, or the possibility of death coming. So it was basically a bit of a time when, in my opinion, of course, that you could just have a bit of fun with people and try and lighten the moods through taking the mickey, taking the piss out of the subject of death and trying to make life more livable as a result of including into the society something that would just bind people together, make people feel warm and loved and comforted, really, through probably being probably frightening people as well, probably be part of it, yeah. But it wasn't, in my opinion, necessarily just about what we've got at the moment. I mean, horror films these days, like Paranormal Activity, that's just designed to be more like a ghost train ride, just something to scare you and frighten you, and all of a sudden, things are leaping out at you just to give you a quick scare or make you feel afraid. I don't think it would have been quite like that in the old days, maybe 100, 200 years ago. Maybe the ghost stories would have been different. The original story of Jack of the Lantern is that of a person who wants to try and live forever. And he's avoiding these various times when he could have gone into the afterlife and had a great afterlife. But he was clinging too heavily onto possessions and the material and not thinking about more spiritual things. It's basically very similar to the story of Ebenezer Scrooge in some ways, although it's centered around the festival of Halloween rather than the festival of Christmas. And it's quite interesting. Obviously, there wasn't a pumpkin in the original. There was a turnip, I think it was, that was fashioned into a candle lantern. And the Halloween vegetables of choice prior to the Americanization of Halloween, because of course a pumpkin, which would be much more popular in the USA, would have grown much better in that climate than necessarily over here in the UK or in Europe. Would actually lend itself much better to be a candle lantern than a turnip. But yeah, there was a tradition of using root vegetables as lanterns. The festival of Halloween is actually spread worldwide. It's celebrated in Mexico, it's celebrated in America, Britain. If my memory serves me correctly, there's African continent versions of Halloween as well. And so it's all over the place. I don't think it's a time of year that we have to be afraid of. I think it's part of our ancient past, part of our inherently pagan mindset. I don't care what religion you are, you do have an inherently pagan mindset because you are human, and humans have a certain quantity of animism inside themselves. I would be of that opinion, even if you're an atheist. Okay, there's something inside you which believes in life, or which has some kind of, if not supernatural, then belief in the character even of inanimate things. So we haven't progressed all that much. But Halloween is still a good time of year to have fun, be a part of community, and to be close to people. Okay, can you actually control spirits? People have been trying to. The ancient Egyptians, their complex funeral rites was all about controlling spirits and either keeping the spirits of the dead king alive through mummification, or helping the spirits of the dead king to ascend to the afterlife. This is what all the pyramids are about, all the engravings and the complex religious ceremonies. I'm sure you know about the references to the astral body, which is mentioned in ancient Egyptian writings, and there's also mentions of that in Eastern writings as well. And some would say there's some mention of it in more Judeo-Christian cultures too. And people have been trying to influence this, and they use religion to do so. So whether it works or not, again, that's up to you to experiment with and play around with and see what you can come up with. In my humble opinion, strange stuff happens under some strange circumstances, and regretfully, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to have to leave it at that. Sleep tight and happy Halloween.